Hey, we're gonna go over how I made this sword. This is gonna be a fairly low effort video. I just wanted to document the process and the thinking behind creating this sword. We're not gonna go into the entire render, but yeah, let's just get into it. I knew what the final render was gonna look like. I had it pretty well in my head. The composition, the shapes, a lot of the colors. Uh, so when I was making this, I was able to stick to my guns pretty well and go for just that. The experimentation that I put in more or less was revolving around the techniques that I used, and some of those worked out, some of them didn't. But I think the glory of the ones that didn't work out was that it gave way to some different ideas that I liked for the final render. None of it affected it too much. I knew that I wanted it to be a sword sitting in a rock with mountains behind it in a field of grass. And I think the smallest detail that I imagined was the piece of fabric that was hanging from the pommel. So going forward, the subject of this video, which was the sword, I really just wanted to make it very modular. I wanted to create it out of primitive shapes, which is going to be the majority of modeling in Blender. So for this one, I'm starting out with the sword. I'm trying this new technique where I'm creating this plane, I'm rotating it, and then I'm just extruding the bottom faces, and then I'm going to kind of play with the width of it because I wanted a thinner blade. But once you extrude those bottom faces and you pull them out, you have your basic sword blade. That's the shape of it. Anything else that you want to do with it can be built off of that shape. However, that's all you have to do to create it. You can play with how sharp the tip is, how rounded it is. After this, I'm going to bevel it, and then I'm going to create a loop cut around the edge of it, and Alt S to scale that out evenly to give it its edge. Before I go on into the rest of the build, I wanted to go over this where I tested my previous techniques for building sword blades, which was to create this cube, half it, mirror it, and then start building it off of that. And it certainly works, and you'll be able to see that it does look like a blade, but it becomes very blocky compared to the other technique, and the topology is just not as good. So it will work, and it probably would work for certain other builds rather than this one, but certainly for this project right here, working with that 2D plane that I can solidify to give it its thickness, that just is so much more versatile, and it's also a lot simpler. This takes a lot of steps just to get to that sword shape. With the other technique, all you do is rotate the plane and then extrude it down, and you have your shape. You're done. I want to leave these things in here because it shows the trials and the experimentation of working with this, because this is ultimately an artistic process. There is a technical aspect to it, which would be learning the application and becoming proficient in it, but ultimately, once you start to get those things down, this is an artistic process, and that's always going to be just experimenting with things, failing at it, and trying it again, learning something from it. Now, I have no idea what was going on with this. To the best of my knowledge, I had done the cleanest topology for it, but when I started to try to solidify it and play with the scale, I realized that the topology was messed up. I still have no idea how I did that. I dissected it, I tried it again, still did it, dissected it. I think what I ended up doing was deleting these faces altogether and then re-solidifying it. So yeah, that's not something I'm aware of how to fix, definitely, but I did kind of start over and I got it to work. Sometimes topology is just does what it wants. Having all that figured out, I've solidified it, and I've added edge loop to it and used Alt S to scale that edge out to create the blade. I'm starting to take this bottom edge and play with the topology a little bit, bevel the edges to create this flat part to extrude, and this is where I was creating the what reminds me of Link's sword, Hero sword, I forget what it's called. I'm dropping in an edge loop here, which I had first expected it to be straight across the blade, but it came out in this triangle shape, and I know kind of why that happened. It was a byproduct of how I created the blade in the first place. I didn't do it quite to the technique that I was taught, but it's okay. I'm going along with it because I kind of like the shape, and I just want to see how it creates that blood groove for me. Now, it's important to note here that all of the tools I'm using are the basic functions of Blender. These are the things that you're going to be learning to use as soon as you start it up, if you don't already know them. These are going to be things like your extrude tool, grab, scale, rotate, inset. Those are the only things that are going into building up this blade. Even more advanced techniques or processes are just built up off of those tools. There's not too many modeling things you're going to be doing that aren't going to be using those tools or variations of those tools. You could think of it like modeling with a piece of clay. It seems more complicated up front, especially without that skill in the artistic department, but ultimately every clay model is going to be based off the same thing, a piece of clay. You're going to be using your hands to mold it, and you might have some tools like a knife or a ball end, whatever it's called, to shape them. And you can have these incredibly complex models. However, at their core, they're simply built up off of these elemental components. So we're going to move on to the handle here, and this is, again, just building off of a primitive shape. It's a cylinder that we're going to match to about the width that I want the handle to be, which is going to be maybe a little bit thinner or thicker than the blade. It depends on what kind of sword you're building. And I had this idea for it to have grip on it, so I added a bunch of edge loops, and then with proportional editing, I started to scale those in, and then I used a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it over. This really didn't work out the way I wanted it to, but at the moment I was going to bear with it, because what my goal was to try this newer technique that I also had learned just a few hours before for the wrap of a hilt, which is to use a single edge, which you can get by adding a plane and then deleting 3 of the edges. Use that with the screw modifier to turn it into a ring, and then raise the Z value of the screw modifier to make it start wrapping vertically. And then after that, you can use a shrink wrap mod to the handle, and it will conform to the shape of the handle. And I have not figured out why I had so much trouble with this. I probably shouldn't have tried it with such a complex model. It worked a bit better with the second version of the handle I made. We can see that process happening right here, and I don't know, I don't want to say it was a total failure, because it was this that gave me the idea for the next handle that I build out, but it definitely caused a lot of pain. That being said, going back to what I had said before, I knew what the render was going to be. I had it pretty set, and so all these things are going to be fairly smaller details that are not going to affect the macro idea of this. So having that mindset, these things are no longer so much of an issue. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. My competence for this is lower. I'm not having so many of those feelings. It's really just I'm trying something new, and it's not working, but that's okay, because I know what I want, and there's another way I know how to get it. And even if I didn't know right off the top of my head how to get that, I know that it's there. And with Blender, there's an infinite number of ways to achieve the product you're looking for. I've swapped out the handle for this more oval shaped with a tapered end, which is gonna work for this way better, at least in terms of simplicity. I started to get the idea that I wanted this to be the handle for a bastard sword. So what I was going to do is I was going to fill out the bottom of this wrap and then I was going to taper the bottom out. And yes, I used reference images from Dark Souls because that's one of the coolest looking bastard swords I've seen. You have a bunch of different kinds. It really is just a hand and a half sword where you have a handle that's not quite big enough for two hands, but it's big enough for more than one hand. So typically it would have a bit of a tapered end at the handle, and then you could put your second hand on the pommel or such. And some of the bastard swords had a severely tapered handle to the point where you absolutely would not want to grab it because it was so thin, but you can certainly grab the pommel, and that's more so what I'm going for. We're just going to speed through the rest of this handle because there's not a whole bunch to say about it. You're able to see for the wraps that I converted it to a mesh, and then I grabbed the edge loop for, I think, the bottom end of the wrap, and whenever I scaled them out, it created a flared effect, which you would usually get if you wrap a handle up. And you can see it on a lot of swords or baseball bats or such where they wrap the handle in sports tape. The bottom starts to flare up where it's overlapping the other part of the tape. Now, for one of the larger shapes of this thing, we're creating the cross guard, which is just a plane that I've shaped into a rectangle. I've subdivided a bunch of times, and then with proportional editing, I've grabbed the end of it, and I've just started shaping it up, pulling it up a bit, playing with the scale. Just, there's no specific way to do this. I'm just experimenting with it, and after I start to get it right, I taper the edges in, add some thickness to it, and then I take that thickness on one end with proportional editing, I scale it down, and then I scroll the proportions to figure out how thick that end is going to be compared to how thick the middle is going to be. This is a fairly arbitrary shape. I just wanted to have to blend the seam between that wrap and the cross guard. A lot of shapes could have been used for this, and I didn't even have to do it if I just probably took a little more care with the wrap. But this is a shape that I like to use sometimes. It's really just an oval, and it bells out over the handle. You can really go as far as you want. You can look at a lot of different swords for inspiration, or use none. You could kind of even take this and do something kind of like a rapier where you have this sort of basket that comes out from it, which is larger than that, but there's a lot of different things you could choose from. And the last part of the sword is going to be the pommel, and this is the simplest shape on here. This is just a cylinder that's been squashed down, and then I use a bunch of insets to start to extrude and pull in the geometry to create this sort of a, I don't know what you would call this, kind of a decorational wavy shape. You can do this in whatever proportion you want, and it's gonna look good once you shade it smooth and maybe even use a subdivision surface on it. It's gonna look beautiful. Throw a mirror modifier on there, and it's done. Oh, I'm going to wrap it up there. I could go into more detail about creating the rest of the scene, but for the sake of this, I just wanted to document the process of building the sword out and how it really is just built off of these primitive shapes that each one we're adding on to. And you can see how, compared to the final sword, which you'll be able to see the final render in a moment here, it is almost the exact same silhouette of it. You can really see where they come from the same place. It's just that one has been taking a little more time to play with the geometry, extrude some things, play around with it, and none of that was really hard, and all of that was really just experimentation. I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to perform these specific functions to create this blood groove and this shape. Almost everything you saw there was just off of the cuff, just kind of experimenting with it and building off of the shapes. It's a 9:16 render for the sake of it being a short, but you can see, especially juxtaposed to the last image, it is the same shape, about 80%. Really just that cross guard is there, and there's some added detail that you can see primarily because the light bouncing off of it, textures, and then I added that tether at the top. A note about the scene is you can see it's really just built out of three main elements. You have the mountains in the background, you have the land that the rock is sitting on, and then the rock and the sword. And that's about it. Just kind of constructing a scene out of these very basic shapes, and then creating a composition, texturing them. I think the most complex part of this was the grass, which was really just a bunch of grass assets that was created with a particle effect, and that is, to get done, it is pretty simple. It can be a little involved to get started, but yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up there, and hopefully this wasn't too boring. Bye.